One man saw it coming. In 1895, Otto von Bismarck predicted exactly where and how the catastrophe would begin. 19 years later, his prophecy came true in the Balkans, igniting a war that would consume millions. This is the story of how Europe became a powder keg and how a single spark set it ablaze. The Great War, later known as World War I, received its name in the 1920s when the world couldn't even imagine that a Second World War might occur. The First World War was the product of a doomsday machine whose operation became more irreversible with each passing year. This doomsday machine consisted of successive and escalating crises. After watching this video in its entirety, I will ask you to consider the economic and political crises the world has experienced from the year 2000 to the present. I think you'll find the similarities quite disturbing. Bismarck's Realpolitik order. The establishment of unified Germany in 1871 led to a tremendous shift in the balance of power in Europe. The German Empire, with its 41 million population in the heart of Europe, became the second largest state after Russia's 90 million. However, Germany's per capita industrialization level was incomparably greater than Russia's. Although France and Austria, members of the Losers Club in Germany's formation, appeared on paper to be able to contain Germany together with Russia, the strings of the geopolitical game had passed into the hands of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, the inventor of the concept of Realpolitik. Bismarck was aware of both the strengths and weaknesses of the newly established Germany. During the German Unification Wars in 1866, after Austria's defeat at Sadowa, Bismarck insisted to the Prussian king and general staff that the army not enter Vienna and prevented the annexation of German-speaking regions through the dissolution of the Austrian Empire. Bismarck had correctly calculated that the weakened Austro-Hungarian Empire could become Germany's only important ally in the future. Bismarck had also correctly calculated that as a result of the Treaty of Frankfurt imposed on France May 10, 1871, with Germany's annexation of the Alsace-Lorraine region, France's payment of an unprecedented 5 billion gold francs in war reparations, and the condition that German soldiers occupy northern France until the reparations were paid, France would become a relentless and revenge-seeking enemy. To prevent another war with France, he would establish his own alliance system in Europe. On October 22, 1873, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Russian Empire would form an alliance called the League of the Three Emperors, Drei Kaiserbund. This system not only brought the two great powers on Germany's south and eastern borders into the same orbit, but created a bloc that France could not handle. Germany would both expand and revise this alliance system despite an increasingly difficult geopolitical environment. Germany would make a much closer alliance agreement with Austria in 1879. The League of Three Emperors would be renewed with difficulty in 1881 and 1884. Germany would also form another bloc with Italy and Austria in 1882. Operating these complex systems was quite difficult. Russia and Austria were rivals over the Balkans, while Italy and Austria were in conflict over the Venetia region and the Adriatic. Bismarck managed to keep this complex system alive by sometimes yoking the horses to the same carriage and sometimes to separate carriages. After 1871, Bismarck would also refrain from deliberately provoking France and would even encourage it to compete with the British Empire in Africa. Bismarck's vision was to increase the country's relative power in the long term by combining Germany's educated population with its rapidly developing industrial base without entering into any conflict. Bismarck was not anti-war. On the contrary, he had used three wars as tools for the establishment of unified Germany. But after this stage, he based Germany's future on economic and industrial development. The first result of these policies of Bismarck was the disaster that befell the Ottoman Empire, described as the sick man of Europe, but whose integrity was protected by the British Empire against Russia. With its hands freed by the League of Three Emperors, Russia would inflict a terrible defeat on the Ottoman Empire in what we know as the War of 93, the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, and Russian armies would reach the gates of Istanbul for the first time. However, the British would act swiftly, bringing their Mediterranean fleet into the Sea of Marmara, reaching Istanbul within days. The warships were a serious warning to the Russian army stationed in Yeshilkoy. When the British objected to the terms of the Treaty of San Stefano that Russia imposed on the Ottoman Empire, Bismarck would step in, gathering the great powers and the parties to the war in Berlin, and the matter would be resolved with the Treaty of Berlin. Bismarck's next major move was the initiative that formalized the division of Africa through the Berlin Conference of 1885–86. Although Bismarck maintained his policy that Germany should never participate in the colonial race, he aimed to hide Germany's great power under a velvet cover by playing a mediating role in international affairs. The conference would be extremely successful. The division of Africa would continue rapidly without conflict among the Europeans. Bismarck's greatest mistake was not leaving a successor who could manage this complex web of systems. When Germany's first emperor, Wilhelm I, died in 1888, his successor's son, Frederick III, remained on the throne for only 99 days and died of cancer. In this situation, the throne fell to the 29-year-old Wilhelm II, a young man who had grown up with traumas and remained mentally childish. Wilhelm II, whom we know as Kaiser Wilhelm, was born with his left arm partially disabled, short, due to the doctor forcefully pulling the baby's left arm with forceps during a difficult birth, very difficult under 19th century conditions. The young prince was a German prince, but more importantly, a Prussian prince. From childhood, despite the shortness and weakness of his left arm, it was 15 centimeters shorter than his right arm, he underwent harsh training within the Prussian army. The years of harsh and uncompromising military training, despite the young man's arm condition, would open great wounds in his soul. In the Prussian military system, disability or what lineage a person comes from is irrelevant. When Prussian princes are trained, non-commissioned officers are specifically ordered to be even harsher and stricter. This is a 300-year-old tradition. We know that the young prince went to bed crying countless nights from indescribable physical pain, from hours of drill on horseback with sword and rifle, and from words spoken about his disabled arm. From the time he was a small child, he was taught to either fold his arms or put the hand of his short arm in his pocket, or hold a glove or hat with that hand when being photographed. When Wilhelm II became emperor, far from managing Bismarck, he wasn't in a position to show patience towards this great statesman. Germany's power in 1890 had increased the young emperor's greed, and the young emperor, together with the German general staff, began openly criticizing Bismarck's policies. After a harsh argument at Bismarck's estate in 1890, it was announced that Bismarck had resigned from his duties. Bismarck would watch with sorrow until his death how the system he had built would be dismantled. A year before his death, I quote his famous last words exactly. "Europe has now become a powder keg, and European leaders are like men smoking in an ammunition depot. A single spark will create such an explosion that we will all be engulfed in flames. I cannot say when this explosion will occur, but I can say where it will happen. A foolish event in the Balkans will cause it." Bismarck in 1895 had seen the future 19 years ahead. And the Doomsday machine is running. German Emperor Wilhelm II, Russian Tsar Nicholas II, and British King George V were close relatives. Wilhelm II and George V were direct cousins. George V and Nicholas II were also direct cousins. Wilhelm II and Nicholas II were third cousins. The German-Prussian dynasty and the English dynasty had become related through Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the husband of British Queen Victoria. The kinship between the Russian Romanov dynasty and the Prussian dynasty dated back further. The connection between the English king and the Russian Tsar was strengthened when two Danish princesses married into two dynasties and became the mothers of two kings. The kinship among European dynasties would not prevent the approaching war. Wilhelm II's first act after Bismarck's departure was to sever Germany's alliance bond with Russia. To protect itself against Germany, which was rapidly becoming an enemy on its western borders and armed to the teeth as a powerful industrial country, Russia would turn to France, and through a series of agreements between 1891 to 1894, the two countries would become allies. The opposing bloc with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy had already been formed. The Second Industrial Revolution not only increased economic efficiency and productivity, but also accelerated mass army mobilization, their deployment to borders, and provided a terrible increase in firepower in terms of artillery and infantry rifles. When Germany had the opportunity to apply the Prussian General Staff system to a larger population, it suddenly gained the ability to mobilize far more soldiers from a much larger population and reached the capacity to transport these armies much faster with Europe's most effective railway network. Moreover, Germany was unrivaled in terms of the training and quality of its land army at the end of the 19th century. Another point even more frightening to its rivals was that by 1900, Germany's land forces had reached a power capable of defeating France and Russia simultaneously. While France's industrial development rate between 1870 and 1900 was gradually decreasing, Germany's was accelerating even more. And Russia, despite its enormous population, resources, and geography, wasn't even a middleweight power in industrialization. The memory of Prussia, even before having the resources of unified Germany, mobilizing twice as many soldiers as France could in 1871, rapidly deploying them to the Alsace-Lorraine border and devastating the French armies sent against it, had not been forgotten. Germany's rapidly growing military capacity had also disturbed the British Empire. For example, it was clear that if a single German army could cross the English Channel, England could fall effortlessly. In science fiction novels of the early 1900s, stories of Germans secretly digging tunnels under the sea or building ships disguised as enormous freighters that could transport soldiers and suddenly invading England one night were frequently written and illustrated. Among the great powers, the United States pursued an insular foreign policy and protected its growing economy with high customs tariffs. The lifting of economic protectionism in the United States would occur after World War II and only after the establishment of the Bretton Woods system, where the U.S. dollar would be used as the anchor currency in the world. The United States' political tendency towards isolationism would first be broken with the famous Zimmerman telegram incident in 1917, but essentially after the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7, 1941, the U.S. would always be the most important actor in global politics. The most important conflict the U.S. participated in during the period leading up to the Great War was the 4-month Spanish-American War of 1899, in which the U.S. captured Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. As a result of this victory, Cuba gained its independence from Spain. Geopolitics is such an ironic concept. The U.S. helped Cuba gain its independence, and in far future, the U.S. would also try to destroy Castro Cuba. The crack in the armor of the British Empire on which the sun never set appeared in the Boer War. The Boers were a people of Dutch origin, inhabitants of the Cape Colony located in what is now the Republic of South Africa. After the British captured the Cape Colony, this people who couldn't get along with the British migrated north fighting with the natives. The Boers who established the Transvaal and Orange republics here were also fortunate. Enormous gold and diamond deposits were discovered on their lands.
Capturing these two small states that attracted the attention of Cecil Rhodes, one of history's most incorrigible and greedy colonialists, was not easy. Unlike the British, the Boers were a people accustomed to Africa, very good horsemen and weapons users. Eventually, the tension between the Boer republics and the British Cape Colony would turn into hot war. After the British stopped the initial Boer offensive and then managed to push back the Boers, they quickly occupied Transvaal and Orange. However, the real problem would begin after this. Boer commandos, the commando concept originated from here, would wage a successful guerrilla war and would give the British Army quite a beating. The British response would not be delayed. A massive army of 350,000 under the command of Lord Kitchener, conqueror of Khartoum, would set foot in South Africa. Many outposts would be established throughout Boer lands, and civilians, women, and children helping Boer commandos would be rounded up and placed in concentration camps. Concentration camps were not invented by the Nazis. The British invented them 30 years earlier in the Boer War. In these camps, approximately 27,000 women and children would die from hunger and disease. When the British press exposed these camps, complete chaos would erupt in London. The Boer commandos would surrender in 1902 after 3 years of war with the Treaty of Vereeniging. The Boer republics would be annexed to the Cape Colony, and the borders of today's Republic of South Africa would emerge. The Boer War had greatly encouraged Wilhelm II in Germany. The British might have a great navy, but their land forces were very inadequate. They had barely managed to defeat 60,000 Boer farmers turned soldiers over 3 years. The British were aware of Germany's terrifying rise. The Boer War had shown the limits of their power. After the end of the war, following long negotiations with France, they formed a bilateral alliance in 1904, Entente Cordiale. A year later, this new alliance would be tested with the First Moroccan Crisis of 1905. France, which was increasing its influence over Morocco, suddenly faced Germany's claims of rights over Morocco as well. While the Germans demanded the convening of an international conference on Morocco and the acceptance of their claims of rights, they also made veiled threats of war. The result was a complete fiasco for the Germans. Although French Foreign Minister Théophile Delcasse resigned under German war threats, French claims were generally accepted at the Algeciras Conference. The British would draw even closer to the French. Meanwhile, in the Far East, Japan and Russia had gone to war. The Japanese defeated the Russians on land and besieged the strategic Port Arthur harbor, and also completely annihilated the Russian Baltic fleet at Tsushima, which had arrived in the Far East months later. At Tsushima, warships fought each other for the first time without seeing each other. While Japan rose to the class of great powers for the first time, Japan would take over Russia's influence over China. The Japanese disregard for death in capturing Russian defensive positions one after another, and their British model navy had created admiration and astonishment. The Russo-Japanese War would trigger the 1905 revolution in Russia. With the revolution, the Russian Tsar would transfer certain powers to the Duma, that is, to parliament and the Tsarist government. But for Russia, the truly major break, the 1917 revolution, was now inevitable. After 1905, Russia would quickly set aside its issues with the British Empire and, with France's help, form an alliance with England in 1907. The point of no return on the road to the Great War is the Bosnia Crisis of 1908 to 1909. Germany, thoroughly analyzing Russia's weakness, supported Austria's annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which Austria had occupied under the 1878 Berlin Agreement. While the Russians were negotiating the matter with the Austrians, a harsh German ultimatum arrived in St. Petersburg. It was communicated in crude terms that the Russians and Serbs must immediately announce they were renouncing all rights over Bosnia, or Germany would immediately declare mobilization. Izvolsky, the Russian colleague who was meeting with the Austrian foreign minister, resigned in tears. The Russians would back down, and Bosnia-Herzegovina would be annexed by Austria. The Ottoman Empire could not protest the loss of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was legally Ottoman territory, and would only boycott fez fabric imported from Austria. When World War I broke out in the future, Izvolsky would rush into the street, hugging everyone he saw and saying, "This war is my war." Russia, England, France officially formed the Triple Alliance in 1911. The crisis in Europe would peak in 1911 with the Second Moroccan Crisis. When the French sent a significant military force to Morocco, the Germans sent a gunboat to Morocco's Agadir port. The Germans sent the message to the French that if they wanted to take Morocco completely, Germany also wanted to take a region from Africa in return, and if these demands were not met, France would bear the consequences of this action. While the Germans showed some military movement in Alsace-Lorraine, the problem was solved by France giving Germany an enormous, but useless, full of tsetse flies, region from the French Congo. The Germans would add the region to their existing Cameroon colonies and enthusiastically name it Neu Cameroon. The French legally made Morocco a protectorate, and this situation was recognized by the great powers. Germany resembled a bully who had been given candy and sent away, despite all the trouble it had caused. After the Balkan Wars of 1913 to 1914, tension between the two blocs would reach their final point. The Serbs, unable to seize enough Rumelia territory, had begun inciting the separatist Christian Serb majority in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Bulgaria, which lost the Second Balkan War, was turning to Germany and sharpening its dagger against the Serbs and Greeks. The Ottoman Empire had lost Rumelia, the most important of its economic sources of existence, along with the port of Thessaloniki.
Another issue that increased tension between England and Germany was a tremendous naval race that began in 1898. This race would heat up in 1905 when Britain launched the revolutionary HMS Dreadnought battleship. Due to its design, the Dreadnought had very strong armor, powerful turbine engines, and at the same time large-caliber guns. It had instantly made all previous large warships obsolete. The Germans would react swiftly and begin building their own designs. The Dreadnought race quickly spread around the world. France, Italy, Russia, the US, even landlocked Austria, and even Latin American countries joined this race. However, the real race was between Germany and England. The naval race is one of the greatest strategic mistakes Germany made. England could never and would never give up its superiority in the English Channel and North Sea, the lifeline of its security. While Germany had to allocate fewer resources to its already tremendous land power with the resources it devoted to the naval race, it was also pushing England toward the France-Russia axis. The gap between the British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet did not seem likely to close, but the Navy would become a means of display for Wilhelm II and a toy for ambitious ministers like Alfred von Tirpitz. The expensive toys of that era, Dreadnought, Super Dreadnought, Battlecruiser, are similar to today's nuclear weapons. The German and British navies would face each other only once in the future, during World War I, in a major naval battle, the Battle of Jutland in 1916. Dreadnought mania also changed the fate of a completely unrelated region. British Navy Minister Winston Churchill had converted the fuel for battleship engines from coal to oil. In this way, not only did the range of the ships increase, but the battleships also left less smoke, which was also important in an age without radar. The Germans had no oil, so modern battleships would continue to run on coal. At this time, there was a British refinery in Iran. Oil was generally extracted in the US, Romania, Iran, Dutch-owned Indonesia, and Russian-owned Baku. The British eyes suddenly turned to the Middle Eastern lands in the hands of the Ottoman Empire. The British had begun to identify regions where oil could be extracted with the famous archaeologist, explorer, linguist, and spy, Gertrude Bell. Gertrude Bell was an enormously talented woman. Later, a young man would also join the exploration team, and this blonde, blue-eyed young man would admire Gertrude Bell, now approaching middle age, as if worshipping a goddess. This young man's name was T.E. Lawrence. He would become the architect of the Arab Revolt in the future. The Germans, meanwhile, were preparing for war in the true sense. German Chief of General Staff Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen had prepared a tremendous strategic plan. Before Russia completed its mobilization, German armies would enter France through Belgium and Holland. This army group constituted an extremely strong right wing. The left wing, that is, the armies stationed on the German-French border, was deliberately left weak. If the French attacked Germany, the weak left wing would be allowed to retreat. The real striking force, the German right wing, would cross Belgium in wide arcs, enter northern France, take Paris between the arcs. The German striking forces would especially bypass the massive defensive systems on the German-French border, Belfort, Verdun, Epinal, Toul fortified positions, and if the French attacked Alsace-Lorraine, after the German right wing captured Paris, it would suddenly turn west and turn behind the French armies, and the French would be crushed between hammer and anvil on the German border. Think of the Luxembourg border where the German right and left wings meet as a giant hinge, and the German wings as a door rotating on this hinge. The harder the French push the German left wing and launch a strong offensive toward Germany, the harder they push the door, and the harder the right wing of the door will rotate and strike back at the French. After Paris fell, German armies would be rapidly deployed by rail to East Prussia and German Poland, and would strike at the Russians who would have completed their mobilization there. Meanwhile, very few units would be left on the Eastern Front, that is, in East Prussia and German Poland, and these regions would be defended with a weak defense against Russian offensives for a temporary period. Germany's misfortune is that Schlieffen died in 1913 from falling off a horse. Schlieffen's successor, Helmuth von Moltke, the younger Moltke, would make vital alterations to the plan. The summer of 1914 had started hot, but everything was calm. European capitals were empty in June 1914. Most of the royal families and government members had gone on vacation, and Wilhelm II was also killing time in the Baltic Sea with the royal yacht and part of the navy. On June 28, 1914, urgent coded telegrams suddenly began to fly. Austrian heir apparent Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serb terrorist. This Serb terrorist was thought to be a member of a terrorist organization supported by Serbia. A month later, the Great War would begin. From Bismarck's carefully crafted peace to Wilhelm's reckless ambition, from diplomatic chess to a continental inferno, the powder keg was ready, the spark was lit, and in August 1914, the world would discover what happens when doomsday machines run uncontrolled. The Great War had begun, and nothing would ever be the same.